today we're going to talk about the Cooler Master NR200P, but not only that, we're going to talk about water cooling it. Let's see how much we can pack into this small case. Hey guys, Tiago with Classical Technology here. Some say every time you smash that like button, I get one step closer to understanding exactly why your computer is shutting off when you're in the middle of Cyberpunk 2077. Alright, so today we're going to talk about the Cooler Master NR200P, and we're going to talk about some of the benefits of using a small case like this, and specifically, how can you water cool it? Does it make sense? What type of temperatures do you plan to have? So I first got this case and I was actually very impressed with it. So I'll say right off the bat, like for the price that it was, I believe when I bought it off Amazon, it was under $100 for the 200p. Now there's also the regular version that doesn't come with the tempered glass or the vertical riser. So most likely I would suggest that you get the P version. It just comes with, an extra fan. It comes with that tempered glass. It's just going to give you a little bit more ability for changing your build up in the future. And I think it was only maybe 20 bucks more expensive than the regular version, which usually sells for around $79.99. So when I first got this case, I went sort of the traditional route with, cooling it. First, I did try to have a regular air cooler, like a Noctua air cooler. You can certainly fit a fairly large air cooler in this case, and you do get some pretty good performance. It definitely has some good airflow between the bottom and the top. And you can also fit some pretty massive GPUs here, like even the MSI, the Supreme GPU I was able to fit. It certainly has the space to fit some of these massive GPUs, and that's definitely great knowing that you're not going to be limited by the size of your case, because as we know, it's hard to tell which GPU you may end up getting. Sometimes the more expensive bulky GPUs like the 3090s may be the only thing available, so certainly it's nice to know that they're going to fit in a smaller case like this. And then of course there are other configurations that you can do with a 240mm AIO. You can put it on the bottom, which is not really recommended, as of course that's going to be well below where the pump will be on the CPU, and of course the best place to put it will be on the side panel. You do get that included side panel. It's very similar to the Ncase N1 and how everything's installed. You do have a little bit more space that you get to use these top fans for some nice air circulation. So overall, I think you could be more than happy with the performance of the system, even with a high-end CPU like a 59 or a 5950X, together with a 240mm AIO and a pretty beefy air-cooled GPU on the bottom. So of course, I was satisfied with that, but as I certainly love water cooling, and in a lot of cases, I'll water cool a lot bigger of a setup. For example, in my Case Labs build or any of the other various water cooling builds that I've done, they've generally been pretty big because then you can fit the most amount of radiator space. But as I started to get more and more into these mini-itx enclosures, and especially the NR200, I thought, what's the most amount of cooling that I could fit in a case like this and pretty much be very happy with the performance and the silence. So first, let's talk about a few reasons why you would water cool a small case like this. Generally, it can be pretty quiet with air cooling, but I think you'll find that you can get significantly better temperatures and even quieter performance when you have a properly running water-cooled loop. So for this test setup, we're going to be using the Ryzen 5600X, which only has a 65 watt TDP. I didn't want to go with something too crazy because I knew the radiator space was going to be a little bit limited. And for the GPU, it's not going to be a 3000 series GPU, but the still mighty 2080 Ti. This is still a very power hungry and powerful GPU. And in fact, for the power supply, we're going to be using the Cooler Master 850 watt power supply. Now, they did send me this over to test, and I think it's one of the most miraculous power supplies that you can get at the moment, simply because 850 watts is a tremendous amount of power to be able to fit in a small form factor power supply. Now, it does have a gold rating, which of course is excellent. Of course, it's not going to be like a titanium level power supply, but really the difference with diminishing returns between gold and titanium, it's especially negligible, especially with a setup like this. Now, having 850 watt power supply, of course, it's a little bit overkill for a 2080 Ti, but in this system in the future, I plan to put in a 3090, 3080, and those certainly do have more severe power spikes when you're playing. They can certainly take a lot more advantage, and I'd just rather have the overhead so you're not getting anywhere close to really maxing out the power supply. So I really think it's much better to have more overhead, especially nowadays with your power supply. That way, GPUs are only getting more and more power hungry, and you're going to future-proof yourself considerably. So definitely very impressive for 850 850 watts in a small power supply. And of course, Silverstone does have a small form factor power supply that's 800 watts and titanium, but that one is going to be the L variant, meaning that it's longer than a typical SFF power supply, and you're going to have a lot more trouble fitting it in these smaller cases. I actually put that one in a Lee & Dynamic, which does take these larger power supplies, but in general, for like the Cooler Master NR200, I much rather stick with just SFF power supplies, just because when you do the L version in these cases, they start to sort of protrude in your GPU area. It's really a hassle with the cable management. This case really is meant for an SFF power supply. Everything just works so much nicer, and 850 watt gold, I mean, that's more than enough for the type of hardware you're going to fit in a small case like this. So let's talk about some of the water cooling components. Of course, we're going to be using an EK block for the 2080 Ti, and here you could really substitute whatever water-cooled GPU that you have. This system, I think, will even handle up to a 3090. I do plan to test that in the future. Now, for the pump and reservoir, this is going to be one of the things that need your special consideration. In this case, I went with the Corsair XD3, the RGB pump and reservoir combo. Now, it's not going to be a D5 pump, but it is still very powerful for a small system like this. The only caveat, I will tell you that the pump at 100% is a little bit noisy. It's certainly not the quietest pump, and it's a little bit noisier than a D5 seems to be, especially in this enclosure. It kind of vibrates a little bit, but performance of the pump is great, and the pump certainly seems to fit the design and size of the case terrifically well. And as you can see here, I have the pump mounted right on the PSU shroud. Now, I did this with no modifications. There are certain things you can do to pull the PS shroud lower, as well as sort of the, the little screws in the back of this pump do not actually line up with the PSU shroud. It's hard to tell, but it's actually a little bit at an angle. That's the only way that I could do it without any modifications, in order to make sure that the little screw holes will line up. Of course, you do have other mounting options that you can sort of play around with. I just thought that this was the easiest one to do that's not necessarily going to require any specific modifications. And even the power supply shroud, I have it sort of at its lowest point to be able to fit that top radiator in the second version of the build, but some people have modified the little holes for the power supply where you can put it even lower if you want to make sure to fit a little bit more up top. But in general, you certainly can do it without modification, and I thought that this pump reservoir combo works really, really well. Of course, there are other blocks out there that have the pump and CPU integrated into the CPU block. That way you don't have to worry about an additional pump, or you could put like a smaller EK DDC pump or something like that. But I really like the Corsair approach. I think it looks really elegant in the case. Very easy to fill on top. It's very easy to work with. Didn't have any problems with air bubbles or anything like that. So overall, I think it's really, really a nice pump reservoir combo for this case. Now, if you notice, I decided to use the quick disconnect fittings on the GPU. That just means I can easily pull out this GPU without having to drain the loop. I've actually been getting more and more into these quick disconnects, even in my larger water-cooled builds. It just makes it so much easier to switch out your GPU. Sometimes you have to open it back up for some maintenance on the thermal paste, or maybe to do some new thermal pads if the performance isn't great. And it's so much easier to do it when you can actually just pull it out of the system without having to drain the entire loop. And in this case, I decided to do that as well. And if I decide to change this 2080 Ti in the future for a water-blocked 3080 or 3090, all I have to do is put the same fitting on that GPU, and it's basically going to go right in, almost as easy as having sort of a standard air-cooled system. So I really like having that accessibility. So now let's get to the most important part of this build. That's going to be the cooling performance with one radiator versus two radiators. So the first way that I did it to test it, and I knew that I was going to have to change, I used just a single 240mm Corsair radiator. It's basically a Hardware Labs radiator. It's not the thinnest one. I think it's around 30mm or something like that. Now, in order for it to fit below the GPU, I had to use the 15mm Noctua fans. Either you go on the bottom with a thin radiator, like a 20mm with, a 25mm fan, or you do a slightly thicker radiator like the Corsair, and you're going to have to use these thinner fans. I just prefer to use the thicker radiator, as the 15mm fans seem to be pretty quiet and perform very well. So how is the temperature performance on a single radiator? Of course, we're going to focus more on the GPU here. The CPU, the 5600X, was fine. Like in a Cinebench run, you're going to reach somewhere in the 60s in terms of Celsius for the temperature, and that's with a room with an ambient of about maybe 23 to 25 degrees Celsius. So CPU is entirely fine. Of course, if you put something like a 5800X or above, you're definitely going to have a little bit more heat, but in terms of a 5600X, that worked out pretty nicely. Now, the 2080 Ti, initially it would be in like the 45 to 50 Celsius range. After you're playing for a very, very long time, let's say if you have the system, and I did test it, a long-term testing, a few hours as the room got hotter, everything got hotter, you will start to run into a lot of heat soak. So that 50 degrees very quickly turned into over 60 degrees. Sometimes I would be seeing around 67 or 68 degrees Celsius if I kept the system running like overnight, doing a benchmark, doing a test where it really stretches the GPU. With only a single 240 millimeter radiator, I think while the performance is okay on the offset, after long-term use, if you have it in a warmer room, the heat soak is way too much on a 2080 Ti for it to handle. And of course, I wouldn't even consider putting a 3080 or 3090 on a single 240 millimeter radiator. The system is just going to struggle long-term after it's on for a long time way too much, just because that radiator is right up against the GPU and you just have those thin fans on the bottom. So a single 240 millimeter radiator with something the power of the 2080 Ti, I would certainly avoid it. While the temperatures aren't terrible right away, like I said, after you're gaming for a little while, for a few hours, you will run into some more serious heat soak issues. That's why I decided to put the second 240 millimeter radiator on the top, and I wanted to see how much of improvement there was going to be. Now, I could have put in a very thin radiator with thin fans and they would have fit perfectly on top. Maybe a 20 millimeter radiator with the 15 millimeter fans. I think I would have been able to fit it on top. It would have been a little bit close in some aspects. Maybe I would have had to do a little bit more modification to that PSU shroud, but instead I decided to put the same 240 millimeter radiator I have on the bottom, the Corsair one, which is a little bit thicker than some of the really thin ones that you'll find. And the only caveat here, the fans I decided to put on top of the case instead of having to worry about fitting everything in. Now, I'm using the NB E-Loop fans, so these are really fantastically quiet. They're amazing for water cooling, and I even use the little guards that the fans come with in the NR200. These pretty much go on top of the fan and it's pulling the hot air out of the system, and the performance after I added that 240 millimeter radiator has been really, really good. Now it will go up to like 49 to 53 Celsius for the most part, but even after very long gaming sessions, after a lot of stress testing, even for a few days with the system on over and over, the temperatures pretty much will stay at that. They'll get nowhere near as high as before. It deals with that heat soak considerably better because now you have the top radiator that has a lot more airflow going to it, and you have the good 25 millimeter fans on the top pulling the air out pretty much without any obstruction. So that basically not only helps the initial performance be great, but it also over the long term helps sort of the heat soak issues to disappear that we had with a single radiator. And now the system reaches an equilibrium and it seems to stay there long term in a much more comfortable temperature for all of the components that are in the system. In fact, even with this type of setup, it's only going to be a few degrees warmer maybe than a bigger system with maybe slightly bigger radiators. So I'm actually very happy with the water cooling setup that's going on in here now. All right, guys, so let me know if you have any questions down below. Remember to subscribe, smash that like button, and I'll see you guys on the next video.